My name is Sarah. My brother was sitting at my kitchen table crying. He said I lost everything. I need your help. My mother was standing behind him with her arms crossed. She said family helps family. You have the money. Just do it. I looked at both of them. I said, how much? My brother said $1.2 million. I didn't react. I just said, let me think about it. My brother is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the golden child. Straight A's, captain of the football team. Full scholarship to college. My parents worshipped him. I was the quiet one. The one who studied accounting because it was practical. The one who saved every penny. The one nobody paid attention to. After college, my brother went into finance. He got a job at an investment firm. He made good money. He bought a nice car, a nice apartment. He posted about his life constantly. My parents shared every post. They said, look at what he's accomplished. I worked at a mid-size accounting firm. I lived in a small apartment. I drove a 10-year-old car. Nobody shared my posts. 5 years ago, my brother started his own investment fund. He said he was going to make millions. My parents invested $50,000. They told me I should invest too. I said no. They said, why not? I said, because I don't mix family and money. My mother said, you don't trust your own brother. I said, it's not about trust. She said, yes, it is. I didn't argue. I just said no. For 3 years, my brother's fund did well. He sent quarterly reports. He showed growth. My parents bribed to everyone. They said our son is a genius. He's going to retire us early. I stayed quiet. I ran my own numbers at night. Something didn't add up. The returns were too consistent. The market doesn't work that way, but I didn't say anything. Nobody asked my opinion. Then 2 years ago, the reports stopped coming. My brother said he was restructuring. My parents said okay. I said that's a red flag. My mother said stop being negative. I said I'm being realistic. She said you're jealous. I said I'm concerned. My father said your brother knows what he's doing. I said if you say so. That was the last time I brought it up. 6 months ago, my brother stopped posting on social media. He stopped coming to family dinners. My mother made excuses. She said he's busy. He's working on something big. I didn't ask questions. I just watched. Then yesterday, my mother called. She said, your brother needs to talk to you. It's important. I said, about what? She said, just come over. I said, I'm busy. She said, please. I heard something in her voice. I said, fine. I'll be there tonight. When I got to my parents' house, my brother's car was in the driveway. I walked in. They were all in the living room. My brother looked terrible. His eyes were red. His hair was messy. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. My mother said, sit down. I sat. My father said, your brother has something to tell you. My brother took a deep breath. He said, my fund collapsed. I said, when? He said, 3 months ago. I said, why didn't you tell anyone? He said, I thought I could fix it. I said, and you couldn't. He shook his head. I said, how much did you lose? He said, everything. I said, be specific. He said, $1.2 million. The room went quiet. I looked at my parents. They were staring at the floor. I said, is that including mom and dad's money? My brother nodded. My mother started crying. My father said, we're going to lose the house. I said, what? He said, we took a second mortgage to invest more. I closed my eyes. I said, when? He said, last year. I said, how much? He said, 200,000. I looked at my brother. I said, what happened? He said, bad investments. I said, that's not an answer. He said, I made some risky bets. They didn't pay off. I said, risky how? He didn't answer. I said, were you gambling? He said it was calculated risk. I said, that's not what I asked. My mother said, stop interrogating him. I said, I'm trying to understand. She said he made a mistake. We all make mistakes. I said, a $1.2 million mistake. My father said, we need your help. I said, with what? He said, we need money to cover the debt. I said, how much? He said, at least 300,000 to save the house. I said, and the rest. My brother said, I have creditors, investors, people I owe. I said, how many people? He said, 38. I felt my stomach drop. I said, 38 people invested with you. He nodded. I said, how much on average? He said, between 20 and 50,000 each. I said, so you lost other people's money too? He said, yes. I said, does anyone know yet? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, because I've been stalling. I said, for how long? He said 3 months. I stood up. I said I need to think. My mother said, what's there to think about? I said a lot. She said, he's your brother. I said I know. She said family helps family. I said I heard you the first time. My brother said please. I have nobody else. I said whose fault is that? He looked down. I said I'll let you know. Then I left. I drove home. I sat in my car. I thought about the $50,000 my parents invested. I thought about the $200,000 second mortgage. I thought about the 38 investors. I thought about $1.2 million gone. And I thought about the quarterly reports my brother sent. The ones that showed consistent growth. The ones I said didn't make sense. I went inside. I opened my laptop. I pulled up my files. I keep records of everything. It's an accountant habit. I found the folder labeled Family Finances. I opened it. I had saved every quarterly report my brother ever sent. I started going through them. The first year looked normal. Returns between 5 and 8%. Reasonable. The second year the returns jumped. 12% one quarter. 15 the next. I flagged that. The market wasn't doing that well. The third year was even worse. 20% growth in one quarter. I remembered that report. My parents celebrated. They said he was beating the market. I said nobody beats the market like that. They said he's special. I pulled up market data from those same quarters. I cross-referenced. My brother's numbers didn't match reality. Not even close. Either he was lying or he was doing something illegal. I kept digging. I found something else. The investor names on his reports. I recognized some of them. Family friends. People from church, my parents' neighbors. He was taking money from people who trusted him. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started calculating. If he lost $1.2 million, that means he had at least that much invested. Probably more. I added up the investor amounts he mentioned. 38 people averaging $35,000 each. That's $1.3 million. The math worked. He lost everything, but something else bothered me. He said he'd been stalling for 3 months. That means he knew it was over 3 months ago. And he didn't tell anyone, not the investors, not my parents. Not me. He just kept quiet and hoped for a miracle. I picked up my phone. I called my brother. He answered immediately. He said, "Did you decide?" I said, "I have questions first." He said, "Okay." I said, "When exactly did the fund collapse?" He said, June 15th. I said, "What happened that day?" He said, "A major investment went bad." I said, "Which one?" He said, "Crypto." I said, "You put client money in crypto?" He said it was a small percentage. I said, "How much?" He said, 40%. I closed my eyes. I said, "You put 40% of a $1.3 million fund into cryptocurrency?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And you didn't tell your investors?" He said, "I thought it would recover." I said, "It's been 3 months." He said, "I know." I said, "What about the other 60%? He said, "Stocks mostly." I said, "Which ones?" He named 3 companies. I looked them up. They were all down significantly. I said, "You lost money there too?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have anything left?" He said, "About 80,000. I said, "Where?" He said, "In the operating account." I said, "Does that include mom and dad's money?" He said, "No." "Theirs is gone." I said, "All of it?" He said, "Yes." I said, "In the second mortgage?" He said, "We're 3 months behind." I said, "How much time do they have?" He said, "The bank gave us until the end of next month." I said, "And then?" He said, "Foreclosure." I hung up. I sat there staring at my computer. My brother had destroyed our parents financially. He'd scammed 38 people. And now he wanted me to fix it. My mother's words echoed in my head. Family helps family. But help with what? Help him cover up fraud. Help him avoid consequences. Help him pretend this never happened. I opened my email. I drafted a message. I didn't send it. I just wrote it. I needed to see the words. I wrote, "If I help you, I'm complicit. If I don't, I'm heartless. Either way, I lose." I deleted it. My phone rang. It was my mother. I answered. She said, "Have you thought about it?" I said, "Yes," she said, and I said, "I need more information." She said, "Like what?" I said, "Like whether he's committed fraud." She said, "Don't be ridiculous." I said, "Mom, he lied to investors about returns. He put their money in crypto without permission. He's been hiding losses for 3 months. That's fraud." She was quiet. Then she said he made mistakes. I said, "Illegal mistakes." She said, "So you're not going to help?" I said, "I didn't say that." She said, then what are you saying? I said, I'm saying I need to see his records. She said, why? I said, because I'm an accountant and I don't give money blindly. She said, to your own brother. I said, especially to my own brother. She hung up. I texted my brother. I said, I need to see everything. Bank statements, investment records, client agreements, everything. He texted back when. I said, tomorrow. He said, okay. I said, and I'm bringing my laptop. He said, why? I said, because I'm going to audit you. He didn't respond. The next day I went to his apartment. He looked worse than before. He let me in. The place was a mess. Papers everywhere. Empty coffee cups. He said, it's all here. I said, show me. He pointed to 3 boxes. I said, this is everything. He said, yes. I said, client files too. He nodded. Asterisk. I spent 6 hours going through those boxes. I found bank statements showing deposits and withdrawals. I found investment records showing purchases and sales. I found client agreements that promised conservative growth. And I found the truth. My brother hadn't just made bad investments. He'd been moving money between accounts to cover losses. He'd been showing fake returns to keep people invested. He'd been running a scheme. Asterisk. I looked up at him. I said, you've been doing this for over a year. He said, I thought I could fix it. I said, by lying. He said, by making it back. I said, you can't make back 1.2 million. He said, I know that now. I said, what were you thinking? He said, I was thinking I didn't want to disappoint anyone. Asterisk. I closed the laptop. I said, you know what this is? He said, a mistake. I said, it's fraud. He said, don't call it that. I said, that's what it is. He said, so you're not helping. I said, I didn't say that. He said, then what? I said, I'm saying if I help you, we do this my way. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means you tell the truth. He said, I can't. I said, then I can't help you. Asterisk. He started crying again. He said, they'll destroy me. I said, you destroyed yourself. He said, please. I said, tell me why I should. He said, because I'm your brother. I said, that's not a reason. He said, because mom and dad will lose everything. I said, because of you. He said, I know. I said, do you? He didn't answer. Asterisk. I stood up. I said, I'm going home. I'm going to review everything. I'm going to make a decision. He said, when? I said, soon. He said, how soon? I said, when I'm ready. Then I left. Asterisk. I drove home with those boxes in my trunk. I had proof of everything. Proof he lied. Proof he scammed people. Proof he destroyed lives. And now I had to decide what to do with it. Asterisk. Asterisk. I spent the next 2 days building a complete picture. I created spreadsheets. I tracked every dollar. I documented every lie. My brother had been running a classic Ponzi scheme. He used new investor money to pay fake returns to old investors. When the crypto crashed, he had nothing left to shuffle. The whole thing collapsed. Asterisk. I made copies of everything. I stored them in 3 different places: cloud storage, external drive, physical copies in a safe deposit box. Then I called my brother. I said, I'm ready to talk. He said, I'll come to you. I said, no. Meet me at the coffee shop on Sterling Street. He said, why there? I said, because it's public. He said, okay. Asterisk. I got there first. I ordered black coffee. I sat in the back corner. My brother walked in 15 minutes later. He looked nervous. He sat down. He said, so what did you decide? I said, I'll help you. His face lit up. He said, thank you. I said, I'm not finished. He said, okay. I said, I'll help you, but not the way you want. Asterisk. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means I'm not giving you money to cover this up. He said, then what? I said, I'm going to help you do the right thing. He said, which is what? I said, turn yourself in. He stood up. He said, absolutely not. I said, sit down. He said, no. I said, sit down or I walk away and you get nothing. He said, asterisk. I pulled out a folder. I slid it across the table. I said, this is everything. Complete documentation of what you did. Every fraudulent statement. Every misappropriated dollar. Every lie you told. He opened it. His hands were shaking. He said, where did you get this? I said, from you. You gave me the boxes. He said, you can't use this. I said, I already have. Asterisk. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means I've made copies. He said, you're bluffing. I said, try me. He stared at me. I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to contact every single investor. You're going to tell them the truth. You're going to tell them you lost their money. You're going to give them this documentation. Then you're going to contact the SEC. He said, I'll go to prison. I said, probably. Asterisk, he said, and you're okay with that. I said, I'm okay with you facing consequences. He said, I'm your brother. I said, and those are real people you stole from. He said, I didn't steal. I said, yes, you did. You took their money under false pretenses. That's theft. He said, I meant to pay them back. I said, with what? Magic. He didn't answer. Asterisk, I said, there's another option. He looked up. I said, you do nothing. You let mom and dad lose their house. You let those 38 people lose everything. You run. You hide. You spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. He said, that's not an option. I said, then you know what you have to do. Asterisk, he said, what about mom and dad? I said, what about them? He said, they'll lose the house. I said, yes. He said, can you help them? I said, maybe. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means if you do the right thing, I'll consider helping them. Not you, them. He said, that's not fair. I said, fair left the conversation when you committed fraud. Asterisk, he put his head in his hands. He said, I can't do this. I said, yes, you can. He said, they'll hate me. I said, they might. He said, you hate me. I said, I'm disappointed in you. There's a difference. He looked at me. He said, what happens if I say no? I said, then I turn this evidence over myself. He said, you wouldn't. I said, test me. Asterisk, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, if I do this, will you help mom and dad? I said, I'll pay off the second mortgage. I'll make sure they keep the house. He said, that's it. I said, that's more than you deserve. He said, what about the investors? I said, that's between you and the courts. He said, I don't have money to pay them back. I said, I know. He said, so they just lose everything. I said, because of you. Yes, asterisk, he started crying. People in the coffee shop looked over. I didn't care. I said, you have 24 hours. He said, to do what? I said, to start making calls. He said, and if I don't? I said, then I do it for you. He said, you're really going to destroy my life. I said, you already did that. I'm just making sure you don't destroy anyone else's. Asterisk, I stood up. I left the folder on the table. I said, everything you need is in there. Contact information for the SEC, a template for what to tell investors. A timeline. He said, you planned this. I said, I'm an accountant. I plan everything, then I walked out. Asterisk, my mother called that night. She was screaming. She said, what did you say to him? I said, I told him the truth. She said, he's talking about turning himself in. I said, good. She said, good. Are you insane? I said, no. He committed fraud. He needs to face it. She said, he'll go to prison. I said, probably. She said, and you're fine with that. I said, I'm fine with justice. Asterisk, she said, what about us? I said, what about you? She said, we'll lose everything. I said, I'll handle the house. She said, how? I said, I'll pay off the second mortgage. She went quiet. Then she said, you will. I said, yes. She said, why? I said, because you're my parents. You made a mistake trusting him, but you're not criminals. She said, what about your brother? I said, he is. Asterisk, she said, I can't believe you're doing this. I said, I can't believe you did this. She said, family protects family. I said, family holds family accountable. She said, you sound like a stranger. I said, maybe I am. She hung up. Asterisk, my brother called 2 hours later. He said, I'm doing it. I said, doing what? He said what you said. I'm calling the investors tomorrow. I'm contacting the SEC and Carter. I said, good. He said, I hate you for this. I said, I know. He said, you're destroying my life. I said, you destroyed it yourself. I just refused to help you hide it. He hung up. Asterisk, the next day he started making calls. I know because 3 investors called me. They wanted to know if I knew. I said, yes. They said, why didn't I warn them? I said, I just found out. They said I was his sister. I should have known. I said, I'm not responsible for him. They hung up angry. I didn't blame them. Asterisk, by the end of the week the news broke. Local investment advisor admits to fraud. Lost $1.2 million in client funds. My phone exploded. Cousins, aunts, uncles. Everyone wanted to know if I knew. I said yes. They said, why didn't I stop him? I said, I tried. They said, not hard enough. I stopped answering. Asterisk, my father showed up at my apartment. He said the reporters are outside our house. I said, I'm sorry. He said, are you? I said, yes. He said, you turned your own brother in. I said he turned himself in. He said because you forced him. I said because it was right. He said right, we're ruined. I said I'm paying off your mortgage. He said that doesn't fix this. I said nothing fixes this. He left without saying goodbye. Asterisk my brother was arrested 2 weeks later. He was charged with wire fraud and securities fraud. The prosecutor said he was looking at 5 to 7 years. My mother called me crying. She said, "This is your fault." I said, "No, it's his." She said, "You could have helped." I said, "I did. Just not the way you wanted." She said, "We'll never forgive you." I said, "I can live with that." She hung up. Asterisk I paid off my parents' mortgage the next month. I sent the bank a cashier's check for $212,000. I didn't tell my parents. I just did it. They found out when the bank called to confirm. My father called me. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I said I would." He said, "We don't want your money." I said, "Too late, it's done." He said, "This doesn't change anything." I said, "I know." He hung up. My brother took a plea deal. 4 years in federal prison. Restitution to the victims to be determined. My mother went to the sentencing. My father went. I didn't. I couldn't watch. My mother texted me after. She said he cried. He said he was sorry. He asked about you. I didn't respond. Asterisk 6 months later, I got a letter from him. It was from prison. He said, "I understand now why you did it." He said at first he hated me, but his lawyer explained that I actually saved him. If he kept running, it would have been worse. The charges would have been bigger. The sentence longer. He said thank you. I put the letter in a drawer. I didn't write back. Asterisk my parents still don't talk to me. I see them at family events sometimes. We're polite. We're distant. My mother looks at me like I'm a stranger. My father won't make eye contact. My cousins whisper when I walk by. I don't care anymore. Asterisk people ask if I regret it. I don't. People ask if I'd do it differently. I wouldn't. My brother lost $1.2 million. My mother said, "Help your family." I checked my records first. I had proof. And I made sure the truth came out. Asterisk some people call me heartless. Some people call me brave. I call myself an accountant. I did the math. I followed the evidence. I made the right choice even when it was the hard one. Asterisk if you were in my place, would you have done the same?